Well, good morning and good afternoon to everyone. We're back in the latest of OAG's webinars covering the ongoing fallout from the pandemic. We're running these webinars monthly now, and the next one should be on Wednesday, the 4th of November. So welcome back to those of you who have joined us before, and welcome to some new listeners. My name's Deirdre Fulton. I'm a partner at MIDAS Aviation and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Pleased to be joined as ever by John Grant, OAG's Chief Analyst. And today we have Germal Singh from the Malaysian Aviation Commission. Welcome, Germal, and we're looking forward to hearing from you later this morning. So we've referenced a classic movie today in our title, The Perfect Storm, and to some extent that's what our industry is facing right now as we get towards the winter season. It's fast approaching. Thousands of jobs have gone in the past few months and there's more to come as furlough schemes come to an end and demand is yet to begin recovery. We're going to take a look this morning at the latest position on frequency and capacity, and then what's happening just in terms of how airlines are responding to the continuing crisis. And there's so many questions that come out of all of that, you know, in terms of what we're seeing airlines doing. Should governments continue to provide support through the winter? There are obviously different approaches to that I'm sure we'll talk about through this morning. And how do airports and airlines plan ahead, given the current circumstances? So let's get on to our first slide. Now we're here again on this heat map, John, aren't we? We had a bit of a debate yesterday about really where green should come. Green probably feels like it should come at 0, and maybe we should get to a more optimistic, I don't know, turquoise or yellow perhaps for sunlight when we get higher up. But essentially there's a little bit less red than there was. We're certainly seeing moves in China and some parts of Africa which are starting to open back up, but globally we're still down 46% compared to the same week last year.
Yeah, we are. Hi everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon if you're in Asia. It's still a pretty depressing story, Deirdre, around the globe. And you know, we over the last 4 weeks since the last webinar, we've obviously been tracking and looking at capacity from both an airline and an airport perspective, which I think is just as important. And we seem to be at best treading water, if not going backwards in some markets. And there's very little hope really, I think, of any significant uptick in capacity between now and probably April of 2021 being realistic. There's no great event, or there's no light at the end of the tunnel that we can look forward to, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we saw 2 weeks ago, I think carriers added something like 10,000 flights in a week, but in the last week we've seen that trimmed back again, haven't we? And I think we're just, that's how things are going to be characterised over the coming weeks, aren't they? That
yeah, some airlines are going to flex and try and stimulate demand, and there are some really strange patterns between airlines which may be more reflective of their planning horizons than actually their realistic assessment. And the one that sticks out this week is most European carriers, EasyJet, Ryanair and others, have reduced capacity in the last week, and British Airways have added 27% back. It's like, what do they know that no one else
What's
does?
happening? Yeah.
A reflection that it's taken them longer to get to this point. And there are other examples of that around the globe as well. We've still got stranded capacity in Asia. That very big red block in South America is Argentina, which is effectively still completely closed. And there are some airlines who in the next 3 weeks have got some very ambitious plans for adding capacity back, but whether they materialize is another question.
And we'll see some of that later on this morning. Okay, let's look now at the regional picture, which you've alluded to some of what's going on. So, you know, we've seen, we're now comparing, we're still looking at this week versus last week, but we've aggregated up the history now into months. Soon we're going to have to either do the chart differently or reduce the size here, because this is going on longer than any of us probably ever anticipated. But we've seen Asia sort of break through that 30% below mark, haven't we? And that's of course driven by China's domestic market. It's been a big week in China, hasn't it? With Golden Week, the 8 days of public holidays.
It has, and we're seeing some really interesting things in China that ask some very deep questions about the aviation market in the region. You know, say the capacity has bounced back. Demand is pretty good. You know, load factors are not where they were this time last year, but even so, they have managed to stimulate demand. And the big three Chinese airlines, Air China, China Southern, and China Eastern, are saying that they're going to be profitable for Q3, essentially off a domestic operation. And it begs the question, does China really need to have the vast amount of international capacity that it was operating this time last year, much of which we know was unprofitable, much of which was part of, you know, their international and global position. But it's fascinating to see and to wonder if all of that capacity will return, especially some of those long-haul services from the tier 2 airlines who had spent 4 or 5 years trying to develop markets and then suddenly saw them wiped out. That had cost them millions of dollars. Will they want to repeat that exercise again? I don't know.
It's an interesting proposition, isn't it? When you think about how, and we've got some slides later on that give a little bit of an insight into some of the key outbound markets for China. You know, when you think about how reliant some Asian markets and other markets are on inbound Chinese tourism, then
Absolutely.
that's a you know, if you talk about structural reset in the industry, then that's an absolutely massive change, isn't it, potentially?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Germal, you're right in the middle of this and an important job in Malaysia, and you look at the region. What's your sentiment towards capacity recovery in Asia at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, basically, there was some recovery around July, August. I mean, some of the airlines were trying to put back some capacity. However, if you look at it, I mean, I think with the re-emergence of the COVID or the breakout of the second phase, I think airlines are beginning to take a very cautious view now. And you find that although some of them have actually filed for their northern winter programs, but we are not really confident that the full programs will be actually mounted in terms of capacity, because we can already see that there are a lot of in terms of mergers of flights per day, or even in terms of cutbacks of capacity, and so we are not really confident that the total capacity file will be exactly what they intend to operate. So actually, it is a bit of a nightmare for planners actually at this point in time.
I think and that's we're seeing that on both sides, aren't we? We're seeing that on the supply side in terms of, you know, how do airlines plan, how do airports plan for what might come, but then we're also seeing it on the demand side in terms of how do individuals plan ahead for travel, given all of the uncertainty. And given, you know, some of that's uncertainty about restrictions, about where you can and can't travel, but some of that's economic uncertainty as well. You know, in terms of, will I have a job in 6 months or 12 months, or, you know, that's a massive factor in terms of decisions about travel, and particularly the big holidays. You know, the 2-week summer holiday or the long haul trip.
And you know, I mean, yeah, it's interesting if you look at some of the forward booking data for the holiday seasons and Thanksgiving, Christmas, etc. And there is just there is just so little booking activity out there that you've got to worry that confidence has been shattered. And we know we're seeing people who are booking, leisure passengers booking on the same booking profile as business traffic, which must be really difficult for airlines to manage.
Yeah, yeah. And all the associated players in the chain to manage as well, you know, in terms of resourcing in a destination, in terms of hotels and catering and, you know, and all of that. Okay, just in terms of just coming back to the regional picture then, I guess, you know, it's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of comparison to last year. We are seeing some positive movements, but if we look, we thought it might be interesting to just look. So the left-hand side, we've got a blown up of the last 4 weeks on the previous slide, so you can sort of see the flatlining position really that you were talking about in more clarity perhaps there, John. But we also thought it might be interesting to just look at how this week compared to last week. And this tells a sort of interesting story, doesn't it, about, you've got on the one hand, you've got a sort of geographical divide, haven't you? And if we'd had more time and had been more creative, we maybe could have mapped this onto a world map, and I think that might have told its own story. But we've got North America and Latin America adding capacity, adding frequency back, and certainly in the week-on-week position. But then we've got Asia and Europe retrenching again, haven't we?
Yeah,
so the net effect really is very little.
It is, Deirdre, and I think, you know, this waterfall is quite interesting because, as much as anything else, what it just says to me is it's no coincidence that Europe and Asia are moving backwards, because these are the first two regional markets where we've seen COVID spike back, and demand has been falling in both cases anyway. But beyond that, if the rest of the world sees another COVID spike, and there's no reason to believe that it will not, then we're going to see a lot more red in the next couple of weeks and more capacity coming out, and more flights being dropped. I think, you know, there are strong and very plausible explanations for the numbers we see here in terms of flights. Latin America has reopened, which is fantastic because it had probably been closed for the best part of 3 months. But the North American one, I mean, it's just as bizarre as the events we've seen in Washington over the last week.
Yeah.
You know, as the furlough begins to kick in, as the CARES Act is has run down, two of the US's largest airlines are actually adding back flights this week. So it's a very strange picture, and you know, with the greatest respect, another 200 flights in Africa and 100 in Southwest Pacific, absolutely vital and important for the economies, but they don't even register really on the radar of global travel patterns at the moment.
Yeah. Okay. Let's look at some country markets then. So we're focusing on Asia this morning, and this is our usual week-on-week versus last year, and you can see again different things going on, can't you? To just sort of further illustrate what you were saying about second spikes. We've got Vietnam, who look like they might be through the other side of the restrictions that came in on domestic travel. So things were going really well in Vietnam, and then everything had to pause for a while, didn't it? Because they'd reopened back up and were encouraging domestic travel again. But you know, perhaps optimistic sign that we're going back in the right direction there.
Well, I think the optimism is as much around how quickly they grabbed hold of the situation, and how, you know, they were able to essentially control it in a 4 or 5 week period and begin that recovery process once again, which is great. Obviously China we've mentioned, Malaysia, Germal, it looks like you're sort of stuck, really, isn't it? There's not much more going to happen until a solution is found in terms of controls and protocols. It is what it is, really.
Yeah, I mean, basically, it's been like I mentioned earlier. I mean, there was a little bit of spike up in August, and thereafter it's gone very flat actually. Because I mean, the bulk of it is actually domestic travel, and as this point in time, the borders are still closed, so you find there's not much of international traffic really coming in, and then, like I said, passenger confidence is all literally pretty low, and so I mean, in terms of travel, I think people are just basically deferring their travel plans. So I think, like I mentioned earlier, the airlines are pretty cautious about injecting capacity, because at the end of the day, I mean, all of them have cash flow problems. So I think in terms of dumping in capacity, I think there's going to be a pretty slow process, I think.
Yeah, I think, Deirdre, I think the most astonishing thing here, and it always just it just shocks me, is when I see Hong Kong and Singapore, and those are now 7-month numbers in terms of capacity in what were some of the real powerhouses of Asian aviation, to still be operating so few seats and so few flights is just, I mean, the amount of hemorrhaging that must be going on at this moment in time is scary. And you know, in the case of Singapore Airlines, which accounts for about 55% of capacity in Singapore, then, you know, a fuel hedge that's been a disaster for the last 5 years on top of that, you have to wonder how the airline is going to come out of this situation and what it will look like when it does come out of this situation.
Yeah. And I mean, I know there's I think from tomorrow actually, there's 2 more countries that they're allowing travel from. So Vietnam and Australia, I think, are being added to Singapore's list for short-term travel, certainly. But I think the tricky thing, and we've seen this, I've been following the sort of story of Thailand and their special tourist visa, which is really about encouraging long stay tourists over the next few months. But, you know, I think the continued uncertainty about so I can now travel from Australia to Singapore from tomorrow. I need to apply for a travel pass. I'll need a swab test when I arrive, and might have to use a tracing app when I'm there. But can I leave Australia? You know, can I get back into Australia without quarantining for a fortnight? And once you start
there's an interesting question that's coming from Peter Keek, who is a regular contributor, and he's saying, asked, you know, when will IATA and the WTO scream out loud for instant testing? Well, Peter, I don't know if you've heard the screams. They're pretty hard to hear, I must admit. It just beggars belief what the industry's governing bodies and associations are doing to really make a noise. But until we get all of those procedures in place, Deirdre, I think we're going to be stuck, aren't we?
And I think that's the problem, that for the traveller, when faced with, you know, and it's not, we're starting to see now that, you know, countries are saying, well, you have to test before you arrive, you have to test once you arrive, you might have to test while you're here, so there's a cost associated with that.
Yeah.
There's potentially a cost associated with, if you do have to quarantine on arrival, if you're staying for, you know, enough time that allows that to happen, then there's a cost for that in a sort of state approved hotel, whether you're whatever country you're in. Some countries are putting requirements on medical insurance as well. So you might have a you know, exceptionally big insurance bill potentially to pay. And all of that's before you factor in the cost of actually just getting there and staying there and taking part in your trip. So you can see why all that additional complexity is going to make not just leisure travellers, but business travellers think twice about this. It's too difficult. It's too difficult.
Absolutely.
No, if I may interject, I mean, if you look at the policy introduced by Thailand to allow long-term stayers, but if you really look at the Thai market, I mean, basically, I don't think anybody's. I mean, generally, if you're going to go into the points in Thailand and get quarantined for 2 weeks, and then thereafter you're allowed to stay for 90 days, and then let's say you go back to your home country again and get another 14 days. I doubt you'll be able to actually stimulate any leisure traffic actually in that sense, because when you look at the profile, average tourists in Thailand, I mean, would be anything between a week to about maybe 2 weeks max.
Absolutely, and you know, at Heathrow at the moment, they're exploring the possibility of you giving Heathrow £150 for a COVID-19 test. Well, firstly, it's half that price in many other European markets, but for a family of 4 to pay, you know, £600 for a COVID test, that's going to be more than the cost of airfares.
Yeah.
And then I mean, even like in Asian countries, like now, even like if you take a case of Malaysia, if there's any foreign tourists coming in, if you're going to get quarantined for 14 days, and then you're going to pay something like, I can't remember, I think off the cuff is about close to 5,000 ringgit equivalent to stay quarantined in a hotel. I doubt any tourists would want to take that challenge up. And like John mentioned, if you were a family of 4, that's going to be 20,000 ringgit, an additional cost over and above your normal package cost.
And you know, I think
there is, of course, a great opportunity here to finally give your mother-in-law a ticket to somewhere like Malaysia or somewhere, just lose her for a fortnight. But I'm sure.
Yeah, moving swiftly on. I think all of this.
John, you'll have an unhappy wife, John.
Yeah, well, yeah. Nothing changes, Germal. Nothing changes.
I think all of this points to the point you were making, you know, about we need, as an industry, we need consistency, you know, globally. We need travellers to be able to understand what will be expected of them when they're booking travel, what the implications of that will be, and then what the experience will be like for them when they arrive. And you know, it's fantastic to see that airlines are being really creative about you know, offers that they're putting out to travellers, and they're, you know, in terms of cleanliness and all the health concerns. All of that is great, but if people at the decision point before that are not clear about what they might expect when they get somewhere, or you know, whether they might have to quarantine for 2 weeks on arrival and 2 weeks on return, then there's just a missing step in the decision process, isn't there?
Yeah.
I think, I mean, the 3 key factors would be the harmonization, the what you call it, the consistency, and the transparency of the SOPs. That's very crucial to travelers. I mean, if these three factors are not taken into consideration, I think it's not going to be easy to kind of convince travelers to travel at this point in time.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's come back to we were going off on a tangent there. Let's come back to our slides. So this was just digging in a little bit behind the Asia changes, and you can sort of see those pockets of change that we talked about across some of those bigger markets, and a scaling back in the Philippines as well compared to last week. So and this is what we're going to see, aren't we? We're just going to see this picture continue through.
We are. I mean, the Philippines had a lockdown and then reopened, and like many country markets, when they reopen, we see quite ambitious capacity being added back, and then over the next couple of weeks, a more subtle and quiet realignment of flights and capacity with potential demand, and that's I think what we're seeing in the Philippines at this moment in time. Similarly in South Korea and Malaysia, and India is, you know, if you look forward at the planned number of flights and capacity in India in the next 3 weeks, there is a huge amount to come out. I suspect it's just overheating, and can't afford to overheat. But and Australia and Thailand, I mean, Australia is still essentially locked down. To Germal's point, it's great that there's more flights in Thailand, but you know, it's probably the market in Asia that has the greatest reliance on overseas inbound tourism. And at this moment in time, it's very difficult for all of the reasons that we've just been discussing. I think one of the interesting things as well is when we first went into COVID, and to partly answer one of the questions we've had, cancellation rates just suddenly crept from 3% up to 12, 15, and in the case of Japan, about 20% of 25% of flights were being cancelled. The one good thing that we are seeing at the moment is that the majority of flights that are being scheduled are being operated, with the notable exception of Japan, which continues to have this 30% cancellation rate. But across all markets, what is being published is being operated, and that's a credit to the airlines in terms of trying to maintain a regular operation and rebuild customer confidence, because we're trying to say to people these flights are going to be there and will operate.
Yeah.
But Don, I think the question, I mean, despite the operation of this flight, I think the bigger issue is the question of what load factors are they operating at actually?
Well, because exactly, Germal. Yeah.
Because question of yes, you can put on frequencies and capacity back. Just to stimulate demand and as well as to kind of create customer confidence. But how long can you sustain operating at 30 or 40% load factors, even though it may be domestic sectors? I think that's a big issue for the airlines to consider.
And I think that's the challenge, isn't it? That if there's no, for countries that are providing support to aviation, whether it's through furlough type schemes that are providing staff support, etc. If there's no new revenue coming in, then that support only just helps cover. It's just working capital, isn't it? It's not. All businesses need revenue coming in, new revenue coming in to help them continue to operate and to grow. So that's the reality of the challenge, isn't it? That for nobody, 30% load factors are sustainable. It's just not.
Well, I think, and you need to break those 30% load factors down into those people who are travelling on vouchers that were issued 6 months ago, and those who are actually putting and injecting new revenue into the airline business. And I would think quite a large proportion are travelling on vouchers. It's not as though they're going to be revenue managed and you can't buy a seat. So I think it's a fascinating situation. I mean, I was reading a story earlier this morning saying the major US carriers have got enough cash to get them through for a 12-month period. Well, we're talking there about 3 of the best run, most profitable airlines in the world, and they have a year's cash to burn. The average cash burn for many airlines probably gives them no more than 2.5 months, 3 months of liquidity, I would think.
Yeah. And yet here we are, 8 months in, and the situation is still continuing.
Yeah.
We've got a question for Germal here. Malaysia Airlines says it needs to take drastic steps to survive, while AirAsia and its various units are also struggling. And so, how is the aviation landscape in Malaysia being changed by the pandemic, and what does the future hold for these carriers?
If you look at it, I mean, both the airlines are almost in the same boat as what most global airlines are at this point in time. And I mean, their balance sheets are being stretched. And I think they're basically crying out for help at this point in time. I mean, whether the question of whether the governments intervene to help them out, or they will have to look at raising equity on their own. But I think as of yesterday, I think there was some official announcement by the government to say that they are not actually going to intervene in terms of helping out the airlines in terms of cash. And I mean, at the end of the day, if you look at Malaysia Airlines, it's owned by the government investment arm, Khazanah. And I think Khazanah will have to make a very critical decision on this, whether to allow them to go under, or they will have to actually inject more equity to maintain the sustainability of the airline. And AirAsia is also trying its very best to, I think, raise equity as well as prop up this cash balances. And this morning we are looked at, I mean, Asia X is also undergoing a major restructuring, which requires a huge amount of injection of equity, as well as the restructuring of its network and its in terms of retrenchment of its staff. So I mean, these are measures that are being taken, but really at the end of the day, we are not really sure by the end of the year whether, I mean, that there could be a possibility in terms of, I mean, shutting down of the airlines. There's a real possibility. And looking at the other major airline in Malaysia, Malindo, I mean, they are also more or less in the same boat actually at this point in time. So it will be a very critical issue for the airlines, for the governments at the end of the day to see whether do they need to do they really need that many airlines, or would there be some form of consolidation, or would the airlines themselves among themselves come up with some kind of arrangement or something? You know, there has to be a critical decision by the end of the year, I think.
I think one of the, you know, it's a fascinating discussion. The real interesting thing is, from my perspective, how far can authorities and support go? Because you know, we came into this in March and April, and airlines were running for support to governments and stakeholders, and subsequently from that point we're saying, you know, this will get us through to September, October, and everything will be fine. It clearly isn't. So we're now back for round two. But you know, how many times can the airlines expect to go back to stakeholders and governments for further support, and how much longer can the governments actually supply that support? You know, it can't be a constant sort of last resort. And if this does shake consolidation, if this does create some sort of more regulatory environment or a controlled environment, I mean, dare I say it, Germal and I are old enough to have worked in the days when, you know, everything was much more tightly controlled in terms of capacity and regulations and schedules. Are we going to go back to a market that is actually in the short term more effective if we bring back some other forms of regulatory control?
And it feels like the sort of the behaviour that we've seen from countries in other aspects of this, so, you know, so tight control over national borders and real individual nationalistic behaviour, you know, about what's acceptable and what's not. It sort of feels like we're pointing in that direction, doesn't it? And is that good for the passenger? Is that good for the consumer at the end of the day? I don't know.
I would agree, Deirdre. I mean, that there's a real possibility that, I mean, you could possibly look in that direction of nationalistic, what do you call it, tendencies of possible national carrier, the what do you call it, the re-emergence of national carriers again.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, if you look at it, I mean, if most of these privately run airlines or even partially run by the government, if they all go under, and if the governments in their own wisdom decide that there's a need for connectivity for economic, political, and cultural needs, then the question of whether do you go back to the good old days of national carriers.
It's very difficult, isn't it? You know, because there have been some very good national carriers, and there have been some very poorly managed national carriers, and you know, we only need to look at some worst case examples in Africa and Europe. And we clearly don't want to go back to that type of environment. So it's a real challenge as to what is the way forward. I don't know what the answer is, but it staggers me that we have some routes at this moment and some city pairs, you know, that still have extremely high frequency of service and load factors of 30–40%. You know, let's cut those out and let's actually try to operate on a commercial basis.
And that's I think the interesting thing is that, you know, we've said throughout this, haven't we, that there were some areas of the market and some sections of the market that needed some sort of structural change before this. You know, there are regions of the world where there were too many carriers and there was too much competition. Nobody was having a sort of a positive share of a market. So What this does is exposes all of that, doesn't it?
It does.
And I guess the challenge for governments is in working out what support to give, which is the right horse to back. Perhaps bad analogy, but
yeah, 25 airlines plus registered in the United Kingdom, 130 plus registered in the European Union, 763 filing schedules with OAG in the last couple of weeks. I mean, and many of those are just suboptimal, subscale, and may fulfill a particular need, but they just do not have the financial resilience to survive such events, and would be better in a bigger stable. But that's where we are, I think.
Yeah. Okay, let's come back to our slides.
The pandemic has actually kind of exposed the airlines actually at this point in time. I mean, previously all the incidences that we had, the 9/11s, the SARS, the what do you call it, the MERCOS and all that, they were very regionalized in terms of regions. But this is really global, and I mean, and this is a time when across the board, each and every airline has been hit. It's no longer a question of being a few airlines being hit around the world, but this is really like global issue actually,
And this is a fascinating moment in time. It's just a horrible moment in time to live through. But from a sort of academic, strategic type sort of perspective, to see this playing out is fascinating. And I think the saddest part in all of this game, if it is a game that is being played, is the lack of communication between various governments, authority bodies, etc., etc. Every airline is trying to play to a set of rules that only it knows and has to try and interpret. It's extremely frustrating for airports and for airlines. We've not seen the leadership we should have seen through this event, I think.
I wonder, though, to what extent we're going to see over the next few months as countries perhaps start to realise that lockdown is not a sustainable answer. It just pauses things, doesn't it? We're sort of tentatively seeing that evidence, aren't we? Where as soon as things start to unwind, cases tick up again. So I think that starts to push the debate onto how do we make this work, and how do we make this work between countries. I think that the biggest challenge for the industry is that process isn't going to be fast. I think it's going to play out over the next 6 to 12 months in terms of how we find a sustainable global way of managing cases and managing transmission.
I think let's not understate that this. We're talking about the next couple of months surviving the winter, but I cannot see the necessary protocols and processes and confidence being rebuilt for summer 2021 at this moment in time anywhere in the world, and that will therefore mean we'll probably have, from the moment we entered this event in March, or even earlier in China, through to perhaps this time next year, still looking and trying to find the answers. And capacity may well not have moved significantly on from where we are today, unless someone sorts this out quickly, and makes some decisive actions and takes some decisive steps. It's a worrying moment. We said 6 weeks ago it was the most crucial period for the aviation industry, and listed a number of things that needed to be done or begin to be implemented. Not one of them has occurred yet.
Yeah, we've not seen any evidence of that, have we?
No.
Let's come back to the slides, because we could talk about this all morning. We've shown you this before, so and we've sort of talked about, Germal, you certainly referenced optimistic schedules in something you said earlier. This picture of continued short-term planning horizons, revisals of schedules. So what you're seeing here is basically what the forward-looking position in terms of capacity looked like each month, back to April, then May, June, July, August, and now here we are as of the end of September.
Mm.
And for sort of reference, this gap between what carriers perhaps optimistically planned was going to happen for the rest of the year, just to the end of December, and what they're, 4 weeks on, what they're now expecting is going to happen is 260 million seats. So significant, significant scale reductions still coming through each week, although we're seeing the pace of change slow slightly. If we look back on certainly July to August versus August to September, the end of September. But you're right, John, we're potentially going to see this line carry on at this level, aren't we? Unless
we are. I mean, we have those 32,000 furloughs in the United States. The news overnight that there isn't going to be any breakthrough on CARES Act Part 2 before the US election. It would be horrendous to think if one of the potential candidates disputed the vote afterwards if it didn't go their way, because it would just delay the decision even further. But the US airlines, if you're cutting 32,000 staff, and many of those are operational, the direct consequence is on capacity and on flights, and that is not yet baked into the numbers you see here. So that's going to come. You can see over the last 5 weeks, EasyJet, Ryanair, and other low-cost carriers have been dropping 100,000 seats a week, and you can see that continuing. There isn't going to be a European ski season of great consequence this year compared to previous years.
Actually, if we go on to this one, John, this is essentially that's the challenge, isn't it? So already these numbers, this is just forward looking into the winter from this week.
Yeah.
But that doesn't assume any of this.
No, absolutely not. So it's only going to go one way, and it's not going to be positive, I'm afraid, and it is extremely depressing, and it is extremely frustrating. But we've got to be realistic and say what we see. So I think if we maintain 60 million to the year end on a weekly basis, that will be much better than I expect. I can see it, dropping quite significantly, especially if the second spike begins to impact and hit markets such as Latin America, where they're still just creeping out of the first round. So we've got a long journey ahead of us, Deirdre, and it doesn't look good.
Yep. And all of that in the continuing set of restrictions that we've got. We showed you this a month ago. So this is just a map of travel restrictions that OAG's put together with Sherpa, and we know that some of these countries in Africa are starting to open up. We know that there are some tentative openings, as we've talked about, through some of the countries in Asia. But this picture is not going to dramatically change over the months ahead either, is it?
No, no. And the frustrating thing, I think, is it's about the reciprocity of restrictions, isn't it? Because it's all very well being able to get to one of those nice green spots, but you can't get back home without a restriction, and that is as much the frustration. It's really, really difficult for people to be able to get somewhere. We've seen people who from the United Kingdom in the last 3 months have wanted to go to Portugal or to Spain, and they can happily go.
That's very close to home, John. That's very close to home.
But they can't come back without a 14-day quarantine.
Yeah.
And Germal, you have the same situation in Malaysia.
Yes, I mean basically, even if you manage to get out of Malaysia, I mean if there's whichever country that you go to, if they have a 14-day quarantine period but when you come back you get another 14 days. So basically you're talking about 28 days in total. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean,
let's move on to
think about creating what do you call it, travel bubbles, even that doesn't really help because there are so many restrictions or SOPs to be followed. So that basically the take-up rate is so poor in that sense. And there is also no real harmonization between the what do you call it, the SOPs. So that creates another problem by itself.
And I think that's the challenge, isn't it? That what evidence do we have of successful travel bubbles actually having been implemented? I mean, somebody's actually asked a question about the travel bridges idea between London and New York, for example. It's being talked. All of this is being talked about, isn't it? And there's an aspiration to put something in place, but the practicality of how that's going to happen isn't there yet.
The biggest challenge is the implementation of it. I think success implementing it, that's the biggest challenge, both for the authorities as well as the airlines.
It's back to what we were saying earlier about if the restrictions, if the conditions that go alongside the implementation are so stringent, then it becomes unmanageable, doesn't it? Or it becomes unattractive for anyone to participate in it. And then so you're back in that cycle of of going nowhere. Okay, let's look at our next slide. So we thought it was worth just showing you this slide. So IATA have obviously made several predictions now about the scale of losses in the industry versus we're showing here their position in February, where a very conservative 29 billion seemed like it was going to be the impact, and then obviously capacity and frequency fell off a cliff as COVID cases globally started to increase. We had a projection from them in June, and we are expecting a refresh of that coming soon, aren't we, John? It's only going to be
yeah, I mean, IATA came out and I
think yesterday
made some comments last week about the recovery is softer than we anticipated, etc., etc. And at the same time, you sort of think to yourself, well, if you're saying that, guys, you can't be holding to your 84 billion industry loss. It's going to be worse, isn't it? And I think we're going to go sadly over the 100 billion mark quite comfortably. There will be some airlines, dare I say it, that will even perhaps load some losses into this year just so they can get a little bit more support than would perhaps otherwise be the case. But it's a dire situation, and it's a 4-year recovery from here, isn't it? At the very best in terms of profitability. This is not an industry where suddenly it's going to go from $100 billion loss to break even in 2021 or 2022. I mean, it's a long way off that mark.
No, absolutely. And I think just this slide gives a sense of that, doesn't it, in terms of when you have lost a third of your workforce, as Delta have between January and July, and we've seen significant numbers across some of the world's biggest airlines in terms of job losses. You can't just switch that back on again.
No, you can't. I mean, some of these people will have disappeared from the industry for good. Some of them will have taken early retirement and find other roles, doing things that perhaps was a secondary piece of work they had anyway, and they enjoy doing more. So we're not just losing headcount, we're losing skilled professionals who are very good at their jobs, and we do not have a talent pool behind them to fill that gap. And that it could be an ironic consequence of what is happening now, that if there is a strong bounce back, and we all hope for that we might actually have some shortages in some very valuable skilled resource areas.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to our next slide. So coming back to Asia, so what we wanted to just illustrate really was the continuing international challenge. So it's very evident when we looked back. I think back to the table that we looked at with Singapore and Hong Kong sitting at the bottom. It's no surprise to see, to see this situation. But I think at the other end of the spectrum, we talked about the big three Chinese carriers in terms of where their capacity has shifted to necessarily.
Yeah.
And I guess looking forward, it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, isn't it?
It is. I mean, these big three Chinese airlines, they've been using essentially their narrow-bodied fleets throughout the COVID-19 crisis, and that's firstly allowed them to have higher load factors than perhaps we would have expected. But it also means they do have spare capacity, and particularly wide-bodied capacity, that they can bring back in at relatively short notice. And I think China Eastern and China Southern started to rebuild their A330 operations 2 weeks before Golden Week actually kicked in. So there is scope for them to bring back international capacity. But even then, I mean, I think in January, we probably never really appreciated the size of the Chinese and the Japanese domestic markets as a percentage of total flying in those countries. And, it's been really good for them, and it's helped them in a difficult period. But yeah, the international flying for those airlines is secondary in many cases.
I think if I'm not mistaken, at this point in time, China does impose restrictions on international flights operating into points in China.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can't fly more than a 75% load factor. How frustrating must that be for an airline at this time?
Also, I think in terms of frequencies, the number of frequencies that you can operate into a particular destination.
One a week. I think it's one a week per destination, isn't it? So it's it's classically very well controlled.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, essentially that we're on this chart here. We're showing collectively for the big three carriers in China, international flights by week in the current week, and you can see, yeah, it's absolutely, these numbers are very, very low and very, very controlled. And I think, my thinking when we put together this slide was more about the impact, the continuing impact that this is having on these markets. Because the bulk of that those markets are outbound, aren't they? And the associated loss of revenue from those outbound tourists.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, so we will move on to the next slide, which just illustrates what we've sort of said throughout about this impending capacity still to come out in the winter. And we've separated out, just for scale here, we've got the three Chinese carriers and Cathay Pacific, and then the other carriers that we were looking at previously. And there's differing levels of optimism, aren't there? So in terms of international flights, Chinese carriers are gearing up for what looks like or some of them are gearing up for a more optimistic January, but we know, don't we, that planning horizons for the Chinese carriers are always subject to change. And then we've got a very optimistic Singapore Airlines thinking that in mid-November things are going to be recovering. So I think this just, it illustrates what we've said in terms of the uncertainty.
And it's the uncertainty that this isn't going to happen, Deirdre. This is, this is airlines that are looking 2 or 3 weeks out, because that's all their planning horizons can cope with at the moment, either through furloughs or just the uncertainty in the market. So they're just letting this capacity sit there, and we'll shake it out at some point. So it's just not going to be there, and I can't see how Air India, for instance, on the 23rd of November are going to suddenly go from 400,000 up to 1.8 million, 1,800 in the space of 24 hours. It's just not practical.
Okay, that's the end of our slide deck, but we've got a few minutes left for some questions. Let's have a look and see what's come in.
Germal, there's one here from Gary Bauman that's very much a Malaysian question, and as a regulator, you're the ideal person to answer it. How are the airports coping? Because clearly, there are no flights, passengers, and revenues. So how does that impact Malaysia airports? Will they have to restructure as well, do you think, or will they just ride this out?
No, I think they have been equally impacted by the volume of traffic, and I think they have taken some measures, like in terms of operation of the terminal buildings themselves. I think they've shut off, like partial shutdown of the terminal building operations, and I think also in terms of providing incentives to the the retailers and all that. So at this point in time, they have not really taken any steps to retrench staff or anything, but basically they are also on a wait and see attitude kind of thing, that hoping that these things will recover and that operations will be back to normal. But I have my doubts, because when we look at the traffic forecast for Malaysia, we are kind of expecting at least about a 50% drop in terms of volume year on year, and so I think definitely they will be impacted. And then Malaysia Airports runs 39 airports around the country, so that's going to be a big challenge for them, because especially in terms of the international hubs. So I'm very sure they will definitely financially they will be impacted.
Deirdre, there's an interesting question from Will Davies about how airlines can leverage their frequent flyer programs.
Yeah, and what the role is for air miles. That's
generate cash. And of course, British Airways have done that with American Express. And on a global basis, there are probably no more than 10 airlines, maybe 12, that have really valuable frequent flyer programs. The Qantas program and all of the US majors frequent flyer programs are more profitable because of the use of the credit card and the revenues generated there than perhaps the airlines. But it is only the top of the very, very pinnacle of the airlines that have that strength and that brand and the power of the credit card and its linkage to air miles. And there are still 730 that are not in such strong positions and languishing and can't use them to provide any sort of cash or guarantees. For the airlines at the moment, of course, selling air miles to a credit card company is a great idea, but it does put a burden on the balance sheet that's got to be recovered at some time. And I think that will be really interesting to see how it rebuilds, because there will probably be some very attractive offers for customers to burn miles in the recovery phase when it is possible to travel, and airlines will be looking to offset some of those miles during that phase, and also using their NDC capabilities to supplement, that passenger who's essentially traveling for a very low fare by making them pay for a suitcase or for an advanced seat assignment or something.
That's the challenge, isn't it? Because that's not new revenue, really. There's a sort of token element, isn't there? But you're right. It's how you then monetize that passenger to plug some of the gap.
Absolutely. And there's another interesting question from Paul Byrne, who's asking about AirAsia Japan, which ceased operations again yesterday. Is it a permanent cessation? Will they return? Well, Paul, I think this is the second time the entity has been closed down, and once bitten, twice shy is perhaps where we're at. I can't see that coming back. It was always a very minor player in the Japanese market and struggled for any presence.
I think that's someone else has asked about how LCCs are coping. Those LCCs which aren't receiving government support. You know, is there? I think we're seeing different things, aren't we, across across different regions, which is more about probably the competitive structure of that region than the nature of the type of carrier. You know, Wizz, for example, in Europe have been bullish throughout, haven't they, in terms of growth? And I think I saw this morning that they've announced they're going to set up a new base in Norway, or a new
in Oslo,
operation in Norway. And that's so that, you know, you've got completely different things going on, haven't you? But completely different markets.
There are so many mixed messages. I mean, low cost airlines are burning through cash as quickly as everyone else, but you know, I think Wizz is a really interesting one. You know, they've expanded rapidly. They've opened, well, I don't think you can call it a base. It's a 1 aircraft operation at Gatwick. They'd like it to be more. They've opened a base in Doncaster. I think that's a 2 aircraft operation. They've registered their entity in Abu Dhabi to start flying, and you know, at the same time, they've put out an RFP from airports who would be interested in a service to Abu Dhabi with Wizz Air. And you sort of think, you don't open a base without already knowing where you're going to fly those aircraft to. So, you know, Wizz Air are getting some great PR and some great sound bites out of what they're doing at the moment. But let's not forget, they had one of the highest cancellation rates when they first came out with their new network, and have subsequently keep scaling back every week. They're making schedule changes every day.
I think one of the other reasons is for low-cost airlines. I mean, they also evolve in a sense. I mean, when low-cost travel started, maybe let's say 20 years ago, I mean, it was basically point-to-point, secondary or third-tier operations. But these days, you find low-cost airlines are also operating out of primary hubs. So you find your cost of operation and all that are totally different from what it were 20 years ago. So that's one of the reasons where, I mean, it's going to be equally tough for the low-cost airlines as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think I was going to say we should probably wrap it up there, but someone's just asked us a question about LCCs and long haul low cost, which I think is it's, you know, it was a questionable segment of the market before this, wasn't it? And it's just hard to see that that there's going to be any kind of play in that space at all.
Yeah, I mean, it worked really well as an experiment in a buoyant market with a very benign fuel cost, and you know, I'm not sure we're going to return to those days.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I am conscious that we're running slightly over now. I suppose there's just time for any final thoughts from our panel this morning. Germal, anything you'd like to say in closing?
I mean, my view is that to get the passengers traveling again, I think, like I mentioned earlier, I think the 3 critical factors are the harmonization, the transparency, and you know, in terms of implementation of the SOPs. I think this is something where the authorities as well as the airlines will have to work it out, which will provide confidence to the travelers themselves to be able to say that, yes, I do want to go on a trip, and with the least amount of hassle on my journey. And the third thing is obviously the cost factor of it, you know, in terms of COVID testing and all that. So these are important issues for you to really stimulate demand again, because when I look at it at this point in time, I don't think travelers are too enthusiastic about traveling. I mean, they're more concerned about job losses and the economy.
Yeah. Absolutely. You know, I think we're only going to see that continue through the winter, aren't we? You know, in terms of how economies will begin to move into recovery, and what that will mean for employees in all different types of sectors, you know, and what appetite there will be then for travel remains to be seen, really, doesn't it? John, anything?
I firmly believe, Deirdre, there is pent-up demand, and once politicians, governments, control authorities can put protocols in places that are consistent, easy to understand, and applicable around the world, we will see a pretty quick recovery in domestic and regional demand. You know, everyone is waiting for that to happen, and we all need to get out of our studies and get to wherever, you know, wherever on holiday, or to visit friends and family. So just give us, just the regulators, please just give us the environment in which we can make things happen, and the industry will make them happen.
I think that's the challenge, isn't it? It's the timing of that. You know, that move needs to be led from the top down, doesn't it? And it needs to be in place. You could almost envisage that we might get to a scenario where by next summer or the next holiday season, people will have had 12 months of this and really be fed up in terms of, you know, getting back to some kind of normality, whatever that looks like.
You know, we hear about public support for lockdowns and other things waning in some countries because they've just lost their patience, and the fatigue is where is worn them down. And I think we need to be careful that we don't fatigue ourselves into a situation where it's too late. Yeah.
Well, on that not so positive note, I think we'll have to wrap it up there. Thanks to the panel for your fascinating insights and discussion this morning, and thanks again to all of you for your stimulating questions. A recording of the webinar will be coming out in the next 24 hours, and that'll go to everyone who's registered today, and that you'll get the slides and the audio as well. You can always keep track of what OAG's take is on the latest data and capacity changes. And if you sign up for OAG's blog, then you can get those directly into your inbox every week. Thanks everybody for joining, and we'll hopefully see you on the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.